On the slopes of Mount Parnassus, nestled in a landscape of breathtaking beauty, stood a sanctuary that for 1,000 years was considered the center of the world. This was Delphi. Here, kings and generals, philosophers and common folk all came seeking answers from the gods. They came to hear the cryptic pronouncements of a priestess, the Pythia, who sat entranced within the temple's inner sanctum. Her words, inspired by the god Apollo, could build empires or bring them to ruin. They sparked wars, founded cities, and shaped the destiny of Western civilization. But was this divine revelation clever political maneuvering, or something else entirely? For centuries, the Oracle of Delphi was the most powerful voice in the ancient world, a place where history was not just recorded, but foretold. This is the story of how a single voice, shrouded in mystery, guided the fate of millions. In the rugged heart of ancient Greece, where the Phaedriades, the shining rocks, loom over a valley of olive groves, lies a place once considered the very center of existence. This is Delphi. For over 1,000 years, it was not merely a location, but an idea, the gravitational point around which the Hellenic world revolved. The ancients called it the omphalos, the navel of the world. Legend tells of Zeus, king of the gods, releasing 2 golden eagles from opposite ends of the earth. They flew towards each other, their paths finally crossing high above the slopes of Mount Parnassus. Where they met, Zeus cast down a sacred stone, the omphalos, to mark the planet's midpoint. This stone was not just a symbol, it was a declaration. It proclaimed that all paths, all questions, and all fates led here. Pilgrims who made the arduous journey to Delphi were met with a landscape designed to inspire awe and humility. The sanctuary itself was a masterpiece of sacred architecture, a city of gods built on the side of a mountain. Treasuries, funded by powerful city-states, lined the sacred way, their gleaming marble facades filled with offerings of gold and ivory. These were not just displays of piety, they were advertisements of power, a testament to the influence wielded by the oracle. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and even foreign kings like Croesus of Lydia and the pharaohs of Egypt all sought favor here. They built monuments, dedicated spoils of war, and poured immense wealth into the sanctuary, making Delphi one of the most powerful political and financial centers of its time. It was a neutral ground where rivals could meet, a repository of wealth that functioned like a central bank, and a source of divine sanction that could legitimize a ruler or doom a campaign. But beneath the gleaming marble and the political maneuvering lay a deeper, more ancient mystery. Before the treasuries and temples, before the name of Apollo was ever spoken here, this powerful place belonged to an older, terrestrial deity. The sense of profound energy emanating from the earth itself was palpable. Visitors felt it, a primal connection to something ancient and formidable. The story of Delphi is the story of this sacred ground, a place where the world of mortals intersected with the realm of the divine, and where the fate of empires rested on whispers carried on the mountain air. Before Delphi became the domain of Apollo, the god of light, music, and reason, it answered to a different power. The site was originally known as Pythia, and its guardian was a creature born of the earth itself, a colossal serpent. This was not a mere monster, but a divine being, a child of Gaia, the primordial goddess of the earth. The serpent was the embodiment of the chthonic, the chaotic and prophetic forces that dwelled deep within the planet. Its presence made the site a place of ancient and formidable feminine power, where the Earth Mother herself spoke through dreams and vapors rising from a chasm. The arrival of Apollo marked a seismic shift in the spiritual landscape of Greece. The young Olympian god, representing a new order of celestial deities, journeyed to Pythia to establish his own dominion. The conflict that ensued was more than a battle. It was a cosmic contest for control of the world's most sacred location. The struggle between the shining god and the great serpent was a foundational myth for the new age. It symbolized the triumph of order over chaos, of intellect over primal instinct, of the Olympian sky gods over the older earth deities. With his silver bow, Apollo challenged the ancient guardian. The contest was immense, shaking the very foundations of Parnassus. When it was over, the god of light stood victorious. He claimed the sanctuary as his own, renaming it Delphi. But Apollo did not entirely erase the power he had conquered. Instead, he absorbed it. He became the Pythian Apollo, and the priestess who would speak for him would be called the Pythia, forever carrying the name of the vanquished serpent. The chthonic energy of the place was not destroyed, but harnessed. The vapors from the earth chasm, once the voice of Gaia, would now become the medium for Apollo's own prophecies. This act of conquest and assimilation was a stroke of genius, both mythological and political. It allowed the new Apollonian cult to integrate the site's ancient sanctity, ensuring that pilgrims who had long revered the spot would continue their devotion under a new divine authority. The memory of the serpent was preserved, a constant reminder of the primal power that still lay just beneath the surface, a power that Apollo now controlled and channeled through his chosen oracle. The stage was set for a new kind of prophecy, one that would blend ancient earth magic with the logic and order of a new god. At the heart of Delphi's power was not a king, a general, or a council of men, but a single woman, the Pythia. She was the most influential figure in the ancient world, yet her identity was entirely submerged in her sacred role. Who was this woman, chosen to be the mortal conduit for the god Apollo? Contrary to what one might expect, the Pythia was not selected from a noble family or a lineage of mystics. She was often a simple, local woman, sometimes a peasant, who was chosen for her good character and sober life. There was no single template. She could be young or old, married or unmarried. But once chosen, her old life ceased to exist. She was required to leave her family and home, taking up residence within the sanctuary at Delphi. From that moment on, she lived a life of purity and devotion, her entire being dedicated to the service of the god. She became a vessel, a human instrument through which the divine could communicate with the mortal world. This transformation was profound. In a society where women had few public rights and little political voice, the Pythia wielded unparalleled influence. Her words, believed to be the direct pronouncements of Apollo, could launch fleets, found colonies, declare wars, and shape laws. Kings and philosophers waited for months, bringing extravagant gifts, for a few moments in her presence. The immense pressure on this individual is difficult to fathom. She was the focal point of the hopes and fears of an entire civilization. The fate of nations rested on the interpretation of her utterances. The priests of the temple surrounded her, protecting her, guiding the rituals, and, crucially, interpreting her cryptic words for the petitioners. This created a system of checks and balances, but ultimately, the process began and ended with her. She was the source. Her role highlights a fascinating paradox at the center of Greek culture. The official, male-dominated power structures of the city-states were ultimately dependent on the divinely inspired voice of a woman. To become the Pythia was to achieve a status beyond royalty, but it came at the cost of one's own identity. She was no longer a person, but a function, the sacred voice of Apollo, a living bridge between humanity and the gods. A consultation with the Oracle of Delphi was no simple affair. It was a highly structured and sacred ritual, a journey into the divine that began long before a petitioner entered the temple. The process was open to all, but only on certain days, about once a month for 9 months of the year, when Apollo was believed to be in residence. The day would begin with purification. The petitioner, whether a king or a commoner, had to cleanse themselves in the frigid sacred waters of the Castalian spring, which flowed from a cleft in the Parnassian cliffs. Following this, a fee was paid, its size varying based on the petitioner's means. Then came the critical preliminary test. A goat was sprinkled with cold water. If the animal shivered and trembled, it was considered a positive sign from the god, and the day's consultations could proceed. If it did not, the oracle would remain silent. Once inside the sanctuary, the petitioner would wait, as the Pythia made her own preparations. She too would drink from a sacred spring, the Cassotis, whose waters were said to grant the power of foresight. Inside the innermost chamber of the temple, the Aditon, which was off-limits to all but a few priests, she would take her seat upon a magnificent bronze tripod. This tripod was positioned directly over a fissure in the bedrock, from which, according to ancient sources, sweet-smelling vapors, the divine pneuma, arose. Modern geologists have debated the nature of these gases, with some theories suggesting they may have been light, intoxicating hydrocarbons like ethylene, capable of inducing a trance-like state. Chewing on leaves from Apollo's sacred laurel tree, the Pythia would enter an ecstatic state. Her consciousness would recede, allowing the god to speak through her. The petitioner would pose their question, and the answer would come forth. Her replies were not clear, conversational sentences. They were disjointed phrases, enigmatic sounds, and cryptic pronouncements. The temple priests, the prophets, stood by to record her words. It was their job to craft these divine fragments into polished, ambiguous verses of hexameter poetry. This final, interpreted prophecy was then delivered to the anxious petitioner, who was left to decipher its true meaning and ponder the will of the god. While supplicants came to Delphi seeking answers about the future, the sanctuary offered them something far more profound, a path to wisdom in the present. Carved into the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo, for all to see before they even approached the oracle, were two legendary maxims. They were not prophecies or divine commands, but philosophical imperatives that formed the bedrock of Greek thought: know thyself, and nothing in excess. These inscriptions transformed Delphi from a mere fortune-telling site into the philosophical epicenter of the Hellenic world. Know thyself was a radical call to introspection. It was a challenge to every visitor, from the mightiest king to the humblest farmer, to look inward and understand their own nature. It urged them to recognize their limitations as mortals, to acknowledge their flaws, their ambitions, and their place within the grand cosmic order. In a world where heroes often fell due to hubris, overweening pride and arrogance, this maxim was a potent warning. To know oneself was to understand that one was not a god, and that human knowledge and power were finite. This concept was deeply intertwined with the oracle's function. The ambiguous prophecies often forced leaders to reflect on this very principle, compelling them to examine their own motives and assumptions rather than simply receiving a straightforward command. The second maxim, nothing in excess, was a guide to living a balanced and harmonious life. It was a call for moderation in all things, in passion, in ambition, in wealth, and in power. The Greeks believed that virtue lay in finding the golden mean between extremes. Too much courage became recklessness. Too much thrift became miserliness. This wisdom cautioned against the kind of immoderate behavior that so often led to personal and societal ruin. Together, these phrases provided a philosophical framework for everyone who entered the sacred precinct. They taught that before one could ask the gods for guidance, one must first understand oneself and strive for a life of balance. The true gift of Delphi, therefore, may not have been its glimpses into the future. Its most enduring legacy was this timeless wisdom, etched in stone, which taught that the most important journey of discovery was not to the oracle, but into the depths of the human soul itself. By the 8th century BCE, The Greek world was stirring. Hemmed in by mountains and a restless sea, city-states were burgeoning with populations they could no longer sustain. Land hunger, political strife, and the lure of commerce pushed them to look outwards, beyond the familiar shores of the Aegean. This was the dawn of a great age of colonization, a 2-century-long expansion that would stamp a Hellenic identity on the Mediterranean. And at the heart of this monumental enterprise, acting as both compass and divine guarantor, was the Oracle of Delphi. Before a single ship was launched, before the first settler, known as an oikist, was chosen, a delegation would make the arduous journey to the slopes of Mount Parnassus. The question they posed to the Pythia was fundamental. Where should we go? What fate awaits us in this new land? The oracle's guidance was indispensable. It provided the divine sanction necessary to convince citizens to leave their ancestral homes for a perilous, unknown future. A prophecy from Apollo was not merely advice, it was a command, a sacred mission. The results of this divinely guided expansion are etched across the map of Europe. When Archias of Corinth was driven from his home by civil unrest, the oracle directed him to Sicily. The Pythia spoke of a place where a spring, Arethusa, bubbled up with fresh water on an island next to the mainland. Following these instructions, Archias founded Syracuse, a city that would become one of the most powerful in the entire Greek world, a beacon of culture and might in the West. Similarly, when the island of Thera suffered from a prolonged drought and famine, its people turned to Delphi. The oracle commanded them to found a colony in Libya, a land they had never even heard of. Hesitant and fearful, they initially ignored the command, and their suffering only worsened. After a second, more insistent prophecy, a man named Battus led the expedition, founding the city of Cyrene in North Africa, which grew into a prosperous kingdom. Delphi was more than a spiritual guide. It was a repository of geographic knowledge. Pilgrims and envoys from across the known world brought information about distant lands, trade routes, and local peoples. The priests of Apollo synthesized this intelligence, turning it into the cryptic but often practical advice dispensed by the Pythia. The oracle was, in effect, the central planning agency of Greek colonization. Its pronouncements prevented conflicts between city-states over new territories and ensured that settlements were established in viable locations. Through its prophecies, Delphi wove a common thread through these disparate new cities, creating a shared sense of Hellenic identity that stretched from the Black Sea to the coast of Spain. This burgeoning world, however, was not expanding into a vacuum. To the east, a colossal empire was rising, one with its own gods and its own ambitions. The world Delphi had helped to build would soon face its greatest test, a clash of civilizations that would demand a prophecy of a very different kind. The year is 480 BCE. A shadow falls over Greece, cast by the largest invading force the ancient world has ever seen. Xerxes, the great king of Persia, has come to finish what his father started, the complete subjugation of the Hellenic city-states. Panic grips the land as the Persian army, seemingly invincible, marches south. Athens, the intellectual and cultural heart of Greece, lies directly in its path. In their desperation, the Athenians send envoys to their most trusted divine council, the Oracle of Delphi. The news they bring back is devastating. The Pythia's first pronouncement is one of utter doom, predicting fire, ruin, and the total destruction of their city. The envoys are aghast. Refusing to accept this terrible fate, they re-enter the sanctuary as supplicants, pleading with the oracle for a more hopeful message. The Pythia relents, offering a second, far more enigmatic prophecy. She speaks of a wooden wall, declaring that this alone shall not fall and will protect them and their children. The prophecy sparks a furious debate in the Athenian assembly. What is this wooden wall? The city's traditionalists and elders argue it refers to the old defensive palisade on the Acropolis, urging the citizens to fortify it and make their stand there. But the brilliant statesman and general, Themistocles, offers a radical and daring interpretation. He argues that the wooden wall is not a physical barrier on land, but a floating one, their fleet of over 200 triremes, the most powerful navy in Greece. He insists that their salvation lies not in defending their city's stones, but in abandoning the city altogether and placing their faith in their ships. It is an almost unthinkable proposal to willingly surrender their homes, temples, and history to the enemy. Themistocles' powerful rhetoric and strategic vision ultimately win the day. The Athenians undertake a mass evacuation, moving their women and children to the island of Salamis. From there, they watch in anguish as the Persian forces occupy their beloved city and put it to the torch. Their world is literally going up in flames, their only hope resting on Themistocles' interpretation of a riddle. All of Greek civilization hangs on the strength of this wooden wall. As the massive Persian fleet, confident of victory, sails into the narrow straits of Salamis, the Athenian-led navy prepares for a final, desperate confrontation. The fate of the West will be decided in these waters, hinged on the interpretation of a single, cryptic phrase from the Oracle of Delphi. The prophecy has been given. Now, the battle must be fought. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, there lived a king whose name became synonymous with wealth itself, Croesus of Lydia. From his capital at Sardis, in modern-day Turkey, he ruled a prosperous and powerful kingdom. He was a great admirer of Greek culture and a generous patron of its shrines, especially the Oracle at Delphi. But Croesus was also a man of immense pride, a king who stood at a precipice, contemplating a war that could define his legacy. The rising power on his border was Persia, led by the formidable Cyrus the Great. Before risking his kingdom, Croesus sought to verify the infallibility of the world's most famous oracles. He devised a clever test. He dispatched envoys to all the major shrines with instructions to ask the seers what he, King Croesus, was doing on a specific, predetermined day. The answers from most were vague or incorrect, but the response from Delphi was astonishingly precise. The Pythia declared, "I know the number of the grains of sand and the measures of the sea. I understand the mute and hear the one who does not speak. A smell has come to my senses, of a hard-shelled tortoise boiling and bubbling with lamb's flesh in a cauldron of bronze." Croesus was stunned. This was exactly what he had been doing. Utterly convinced of Delphi's divine power, he showered the sanctuary with gifts of staggering opulence, massive ingots of pure gold, a golden lion statue, silver mixing bowls of immense size. His patronage made Delphi one of the wealthiest institutions in the ancient world. Now, certain he was consulting a true divine voice, he asked the question that truly mattered. If I march against Persia, will I be victorious? The oracle's answer has echoed through history, a masterclass in prophetic ambiguity. The Pythia stated, "If Croesus crosses the Halys River, he will destroy a great empire." Hearing only what he wanted to hear, the Lydian king was overjoyed. He saw the prophecy as a divine guarantee of his own triumph. Filled with confidence and hubris, he gathered his armies, crossed the river, and engaged the forces of Cyrus the Great. The war was a catastrophe for Lydia. Croesus was decisively defeated, his capital was captured, and his kingdom was absorbed into the Persian Empire. The great empire that he destroyed, as the oracle had so cleverly foretold, was his own. In the aftermath, the captured king sent his chains to Delphi, asking if the Greek gods were not ashamed to have deceived him. The Pythia's reply was chillingly logical. She explained that the prophecy had been fulfilled exactly as spoken. It was his responsibility, and his alone, to have asked a second, clarifying question. Which empire? The story of Croesus became a foundational legend for the Oracle, a timeless cautionary tale about the danger of pride and the profound truth that the gods offer guidance, not simple answers. The burden of interpretation and its heavy consequences always rests on mortal minds. Sparta. The name itself conjures images of discipline, austerity, and unparalleled military prowess. In the landscape of ancient Greece, it was an outlier, a society organized not for commerce or art, but for war. And this unique, rigid social order was inextricably linked with the Oracle of Delphi. From their mythical lawgiver, Lycurgus, to their strange dual monarchy, the Spartans believed their entire way of life was divinely sanctioned by Apollo. They were perhaps the most pious of all Greeks, and they rarely undertook any significant state action, be it declaring war or appointing a general, without first consulting the Pythia. This deep reverence made them a favored client of the Oracle, creating a powerful bond that would shape the destiny of Greece. When the long-simmering rivalry between Athens and Sparta finally erupted into the Peloponnesian War in 431 BCE, this relationship proved decisive. While Athens controlled the seas with its navy, Sparta dominated the land with its hoplites. But the war was also a battle for legitimacy, for the favor of the gods. Early in the conflict, the Spartans sought Delphi's guidance. The oracle's response was a powerful boost to their cause. The Pythia not only predicted a Spartan victory, but declared that the god Apollo himself would aid them, whether they called upon him or not. This prophecy was a masterful piece of political and psychological warfare. It transformed the struggle from a mere power contest into a sacred crusade. Sparta was now the chosen instrument of the gods, fighting against an arrogant and impious Athenian empire. The pronouncement helped solidify Sparta's coalition, the Peloponnesian League, and sowed doubt among Athens's allies. For nearly 3 decades, the Greek world tore itself apart in a brutal conflict. In the end, in 404 BCE, the oracle's prophecy was fulfilled. Athens was defeated, its empire dismantled, and Sparta stood as the undisputed master of Greece. But victory brought with it the very poison the oracle had warned them about in other prophecies. A separate Delphic warning had cautioned Sparta against the love of money, predicting it alone would be their undoing. In the aftermath of the war, a flood of tribute and wealth from the former Athenian Empire poured into the traditionally austere city. This influx of silver and gold corrupted their famously disciplined society, creating vast inequalities and eroding the values that had made them strong. Their supremacy was fleeting. Just 33 years after their great victory, a resurgent Thebes shattered the Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. Spartan dominance was broken, permanently. The oracle had been right on both counts. It had prophesied the victory that elevated Sparta to its greatest height, and it had also identified the fatal flaw that would lead to its swift and irreversible decline. For Sparta, the divine word from Delphi was a double-edged sword, delivering both their ultimate triumph and the blueprint for their tragic fall. For centuries, the sanctuary at Delphi had been regarded as the common center of the Greek world, an inviolable space where all Hellenes could seek divine counsel. Its neutrality was protected by the Amphictyonic League, an ancient association of Greek tribes. But as the power and wealth of the sanctuary grew, so too did the temptation to control it. The ground that was supposed to be above politics became the ultimate political prize. What followed was a series of conflicts known as the Sacred Wars, fought not for territory or trade, but for control over the voice of Apollo himself. The First Sacred War, around 595 BCE, set the precedent. The nearby city of Kira had been exploiting its position to levy exorbitant fees on pilgrims traveling to Delphi. The Amphictyonic League, led by Athens and Sicyon, intervened, waging a decade-long war that ended with the complete destruction of Kira. The conflict established a crucial principle. Delphi was to be autonomous, free from the domination of any single power. But this principle would be violently challenged 2 centuries later. In 356 BCE, the Third Sacred War erupted, a conflict far more destructive and consequential than the first. The Phocians, a tribe within the Amphictyonic League, were accused of cultivating sacred land and were hit with a massive, ruinous fine. In response, they did the unthinkable. They seized the sanctuary of Delphi itself. Led by daring generals, the Phocians took possession of the temple and its legendary treasury. Using the accumulated wealth of centuries, the offerings of kings like Croesus and victorious city-states, they hired a vast army of mercenaries. This act of profound sacrilege shocked the Greek world. Thebes, the leading power in Greece at the time, declared a holy war to liberate the shrine. The conflict spiraled, drawing in nearly every major state, including Athens and Sparta. For 10 years, Greece was consumed by a brutal war centered on its most holy site. The Phocians, funded by divine treasure, managed to hold off the powerful Theban-led coalition, plunging the entire region into chaos and instability. The endless fighting created a power vacuum, and a shrewd, ambitious monarch on the northern fringe of the Greek world saw his opportunity. Philip II of Macedon, a master strategist and diplomat, had been steadily consolidating his power. Posing as a pious defender of Apollo, he accepted an invitation from the desperate allies to intervene. His newly reformed Macedonian army was disciplined, professional, and unstoppable. He swiftly crushed the Phocians in 346 BCE, ending the war and restoring the sanctuary. Philip was hailed as a hero, the savior of Delphi. As a reward, he was granted the Phocians 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council. This gave him a legitimate, powerful voice in the heart of Greek affairs. The war to control the Oracle had ironically delivered a perfect opening for the man who would soon end the era of the independent Greek city-state. The sanctuary was safe, but the freedom of its worshippers was now in peril. As the classical age of the Greek city-states began to wane, a new, formidable power was rising in the north. Macedon, long considered a rustic kingdom on the periphery of the Hellenic world, was being forged into a military machine by its brilliant and ruthless king, Philip II. Philip understood that conquest required more than just soldiers and siege engines. It required legitimacy. And in the Greek world, the ultimate source of legitimacy flowed from the sacred slopes of Mount Parnassus. To truly dominate Greece, he first needed to influence Delphi. His opportunity arrived with the Third Sacred War, a conflict sparked when the Phocians seized the sanctuary of Apollo. Philip positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as the pious champion of the god, the avenger of a great sacrilege. While Athens and Sparta debated, Philip acted. He drove the Phocians from Delphi and, in doing so, gained immense prestige. But his true genius lay in his understanding of power's subtler mechanics. He controlled the rich gold mines of Thrace, and he used this wealth to devastating effect. Ancient writers spoke of his belief that no fortress was unconquerable if a mule laden with gold could be driven up to its gates. This same principle was applied to the politics surrounding the Oracle. Through immense donations and strategic political maneuvering, Philip secured a dominant role on the Amphictyonic Council, the religious body that administered Delphi. He effectively purchased the seat that had belonged to the defeated Phocians. Suddenly, the king of Macedon was a central player in the most important religious institution in Greece. The oracle's pronouncements began to subtly shift, becoming more ambiguous or even favorable towards Macedonian interests. His enemies, like the Athenian orator Demosthenes, warned furiously of this manipulation, claiming Philip was using the god's voice to lull the Greeks into a false sense of security. Philip's golden spears proved as effective as his iron ones, undermining alliances and sowing discord among his rivals. He had turned the spiritual heart of Greece into a potent tool of his foreign policy. The Oracle, which had once guided city-states to freedom, was now helping to pave the way for a king. Philip had mastered the art of using the sanctuary for his own ends, but his son would approach Delphi not with gold, but with a sheer force of will that would demand a prophecy to change the world. The assassination of Philip II in 336 BC thrust his 20-year-old son, Alexander, onto the throne. The young king inherited not only his father's army, but also his audacious plan, the invasion of the vast Persian Empire. To lead such a monumental campaign, Alexander needed more than just tactical brilliance. He needed a divine mandate. He journeyed to Delphi seeking the blessing of Apollo, but his timing was poor. He arrived on a day deemed inauspicious, a period when the Pythia was forbidden from issuing prophecies. The priests politely informed him that he must wait. But Alexander was not a man accustomed to waiting. Consumed by ambition and a burning sense of destiny, he refused to be turned away. According to the historian Plutarch, the impatient young king strode into the temple, found the Pythia, and began to physically pull her towards the tripod in the inner sanctum. Startled and overwhelmed by his intensity, the priestess gave up her resistance. As he pulled her along, she exclaimed, "My son, you are invincible." Upon hearing these words, Alexander immediately released her. He declared that he had the answer he sought and required no further prophecy. He departed from Delphi at once, his purpose affirmed. This extraordinary event marked a profound shift in the relationship between supplicant and oracle. No longer was a king or a general a humble petitioner waiting for the god's word. Here, the supplicant had, through sheer force of will, compelled the prophecy he desired. Whether the Pythia's cry was a genuine, divinely inspired utterance, a statement of frustration, or a clever concession to a dangerous young man, it ultimately did not matter. Alexander chose to interpret it as the definitive voice of Apollo. He used the proclamation of his invincibility as a powerful piece of propaganda, bolstering the morale of his soldiers as they prepared to face the might of Persia. The story became a cornerstone of his legend, an early sign of a man who did not merely follow fate, but seemed to bend it to his will. With the blessing of Apollo, whether freely given or not, Alexander marched east. The world would never be the same. But as empires rise and fall, so too do the fortunes of their most sacred places. A new power was stirring in the West, one that would soon look to Delphi for its own answers. While Alexander's successors carved up his empire in the East, a new power was methodically consolidating its strength on the Italian peninsula. The Roman Republic, practical, disciplined, and deeply superstitious, was on a path to domination. As its influence expanded, it inevitably came into contact with the older, revered institutions of the Greek world. For the Romans, Delphi was not a place to be manipulated with the audacity of an Alexander, but a source of ancient wisdom to be consulted with caution and respect. Even in Rome's legendary past, the oracle played a role. One story tells of the last king of Rome sending his sons to Delphi to inquire about the future. They were accompanied by their cousin, Lucius Junius Brutus, who feigned foolishness to protect himself. While the princes asked who would rule next, Brutus fell and kissed the earth, correctly interpreting the oracle's cryptic hint that the first to kiss his mother would be supreme. He understood mother to mean the earth itself, and he would go on to become a founder of the Republic. Later, during Rome's most desperate hour in the Second Punic War, the city turned to Delphi for guidance. The brilliant Carthaginian general, Hannibal, had repeatedly defeated their legions and was threatening the very existence of Rome. In 216 BC, a formal delegation was sent to ask Apollo how they might achieve victory. The Pythia's response was specific. She instructed the Romans to seek out the Great Mother, the goddess Cybele, from her home in Asia Minor and bring her sacred icon to Rome. It was a remarkable instruction, asking the conservative Romans to adopt a foreign, exotic deity into their state religion. Yet, so great was their desperation and their respect for the oracle, they obeyed. A special embassy was dispatched, and the sacred stone representing the goddess was brought to the city with great ceremony. Soon after, Roman fortunes in the war began to improve. For Rome, consulting Delphi was both an act of genuine piety and a shrewd political move. By showing deference to the most respected shrine in the Hellenic world, they presented themselves not as barbarian conquerors, but as legitimate heirs to its traditions. For a time, Rome treated the sanctuary with a reverence befitting its history. But the respect of the Republic would not last. As civil war later tore Rome apart, its generals would come not for prophecy, but for treasure. The late Roman Republic was a brutal age of ambition. The old traditions of civic duty gave way to the cult of personality, as powerful generals commanded armies loyal only to them. These vast legions were expensive, and their commanders were constantly in need of funds to ensure their loyalty. For Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a brilliant but merciless general locked in a struggle for control of Rome, no source of wealth was off-limits, not even the sacred treasuries of the gods. In 86 BC, while campaigning in Greece against Mithridates of Pontus, Sulla found his military chest empty. He needed money to pay his soldiers, and he turned his gaze to the accumulated wealth of Greece's most famous sanctuaries, Olympia, Epidaurus, and most notably, Delphi. For 1,000 years, kings, cities, and wealthy pilgrims had showered the sanctuary of Apollo with priceless offerings. The treasuries were filled with gold tripods, silver bowls, and bronze statues of immense artistic and religious value. Sulla dispatched one of his men, a Phocian named Capys, with orders to borrow these treasures for the war effort. The priests at Delphi were aghast. This was not a consultation. It was a demand backed by the threat of overwhelming force. They tried to stall, hoping to dissuade the Romans. In a desperate attempt to appeal to Sulla's sense of piety, they told Capys they had heard the sound of Apollo's lyre playing from within the inaccessible inner sanctum, a clear sign of the god's displeasure. Capys relayed this information to his commander. Sulla's response was chilling in its cynicism. He wrote back that Capys should proceed without hesitation. The music, Sulla claimed, was not a sign of anger, but of joy. The god was clearly happy to be contributing to his victory. There could be no further argument. The Roman soldiers entered the sacred precinct and systematically stripped it of its offerings. Centuries of devotion were inventoried, valued as bullion, and carted away. It was a profound desecration, an act that demonstrated the complete vulnerability of the old sacred order in the face of Roman military power. The divine protection of Apollo had proven no match for the needs of a Roman general. The gold of the god was melted down to mint coins that paid the very soldiers who had taken it. The sanctuary was left diminished, a shadow of its former self. A physical wound had been inflicted, but an even deeper spiritual one remained. Could Delphi ever recover? Its fate would now lie in the hands of a man who was both its priest and its greatest historian. Centuries after its golden age, and long after the trauma of Sulla's plunder, Delphi found an unlikely champion. He was not a king seeking legitimacy or a general demanding a favorable omen, but a scholar and philosopher who dedicated his life to preserving the legacy of the Hellenic world. His name was Plutarch, and from the end of the 1st century AD, he served as one of the chief priests of Apollo at Delphi. Living in nearby Chaeronea, Plutarch's duties gave him an intimate, first-hand perspective on the oracle's workings during the Roman Empire. This was a different Delphi from the one that had advised city-states and kings. The crowds were smaller, the offerings less extravagant, and the prophecies themselves had changed. The grand, ambiguous poetry of the classical era had given way to simpler, more direct prose answers to personal questions. In his collection of essays known as the Delphic Dialogues, Plutarch grapples with the sanctuary's diminished state. In a work titled On the Obsolescence of Oracles, he has his characters debate the very questions that troubled believers of his time. Why had so many other oracles across the Greek world fallen silent? Why was the Pythia's inspiration seemingly weaker than before? Plutarch, a man of both deep faith and intellectual curiosity, offered a range of explanations. He suggested that the physical vapors, the pneuma that inspired the Pythia, might be fainter than they once were, a natural phenomenon. Yet, he never abandoned his core belief in the divine presence of Apollo. For him, the god was eternal, even if the methods he used to communicate with humanity might change over time. Under the patronage of Philhellenic emperors like Hadrian, who greatly admired Greek culture, Plutarch worked tirelessly to restore some of the sanctuary's prestige. He oversaw repairs and promoted its importance as a center of learning and traditional piety. He was a bridge between two worlds, the glorious past of an independent Greece, which he chronicled in his famous biographies, and the present reality of a province within the vast Roman Empire. Through Plutarch's efforts, Delphi experienced a brief but brilliant twilight. He preserved its memory and its meaning for future generations. But the world was changing in ways even he could not foresee. New beliefs were spreading across the empire, and the voice of a single god from a mountain in Greece was growing fainter, soon to be challenged by a faith that claimed to speak for all mankind. In the year 66 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero arrived in Greece. This was not a pilgrimage of a humble seeker, but the grand theatrical tour of a man who saw himself as a living god. For Nero, Greece was not a land of sacred history, but a stage for his own talents. His visit to Delphi was the ultimate expression of this imperial ego. The Pythian Games, one of the 4 great Panhellenic festivals, were traditionally held every 4 years. For Nero, tradition was an inconvenience. He ordered the games to be held out of sequence to coincide with his visit, a move of breathtaking arrogance that placed his personal schedule above centuries of religious custom. He competed in multiple events, from lyre playing to chariot racing, and, unsurprisingly, was declared the victor in every single one. The judges, facing the absolute power of the emperor, had little choice but to award him the laurel wreaths. But Nero's relationship with the oracle was far more fraught. He sought a prophecy, as countless leaders had before him. The Pythia's words, however, were not the fawning praise he expected. Ancient sources record a cryptic warning, cautioning him to beware the 73rd year. Nero, then only around 30 years old, reportedly took this as a promise of a long life. He failed to understand it was a reference to his eventual successor, Galba, who would rise to power at the age of 73 after Nero's own downfall. Enraged by the oracle's perceived impertinence and driven by his insatiable greed, Nero exacted his revenge. He declared the oracle a fraud and then proceeded to plunder the sanctuary. This was not the looting of a common thief. It was a systematic removal of treasures. Historical accounts claim his men carried away over 500 of Delphi's most celebrated bronze and marble statues. These masterpieces, offerings from grateful kings and cities over centuries, were shipped to Rome to decorate his opulent new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was a profound act of sacrilege, reducing a sacred precinct to a personal art gallery. The act sent a shockwave through the Greek world. The emperor had not just taken art, he had stolen the sanctuary's soul, its physical memory of glory and divine favor. Nero's tour was a deep and painful wound, a demonstration that the power of Rome could now overwhelm even the most sacred traditions of the ancient world. The sanctuary had survived wars and political turmoil, but this personal violation by the master of the world felt different. It was a sign that the old certainties were crumbling, and the voice of Apollo was no longer the most powerful force in the land. The centuries following Nero's brazen act of plunder saw a slow, uneven decline for Delphi. The sanctuary was no longer the undisputed center of the Greek world, but it was not yet abandoned. Certain Roman emperors, men who genuinely admired Greek culture, attempted to restore some of its former glory. The Emperor Hadrian, a devoted Philhellene, visited in the 2nd century AD. He offered his support, funding repairs, and showing reverence for the traditions. His patronage provided a welcome but temporary reprieve. The deeper issue was not collapsing buildings, but a collapsing worldview. The very foundations of the pagan belief system were being eroded by powerful new currents of thought and faith sweeping across the Roman Empire. The rise of Christianity, in particular, offered a radically different vision of the divine. This new monotheistic faith, with its promise of universal salvation and a single, all-powerful God, presented a direct challenge to the entire pantheon of Greek gods, including Apollo himself. As the new faith gained converts, from the lowest slaves to the highest echelons of society, the old ways began to seem obsolete. The stream of wealthy patrons and official state delegations to Delphi dwindled to a trickle. Why consult a local mountain spirit when a universal savior was offered? The oracle's pronouncements became less frequent and carried far less weight in the corridors of power. The intellectual elites of the era also grappled with the oracle's fading influence. Plutarch, the famous biographer and essayist, served as one of the chief priests at Delphi for the last 30 years of his life. He witnessed the decline firsthand and wrote extensively on the subject in works like On the Obsolescence of Oracles. He debated the potential causes. Had the mysterious vapors that inspired the Pythia simply run out? Had the gods partially withdrawn from the world? Or, perhaps most profoundly, had humanity simply stopped listening? Plutarch and his contemporaries were living through a profound spiritual transition. The old certainties that had guided civilization for a millennium were dissolving. The sanctuary, once a bustling hub of international politics and religion, grew quieter. The treasuries stood empty, the great statues were gone, and the sacred way was trodden by fewer and fewer pilgrims. The voice that had guided heroes and founded cities was now a frail whisper, easily lost in the winds of change. The final confrontation was drawing near, not with a foreign army, but with an empire that had adopted a new god and had no more use for the old ones. In the year 362 AD, a final, hopeful delegation made its way up the slopes of Parnassus. It was sent by a man who sought to turn back the tide of history, the Roman Emperor Julian. Raised a Christian, Julian had secretly embraced the old pagan traditions, and upon taking the throne, he launched an ambitious and ultimately doomed campaign to restore the Hellenic gods to their former glory. History, written by his Christian successors, would brand him Julian the Apostate. But for a brief moment, he was the last hope for places like Delphi. Julian sent his trusted physician and questor, Oribasius, to the ancient sanctuary. His mission was to inquire if the oracle could be revived and if the temple could be rebuilt to its former splendor. He came bearing imperial gold and the promise of a pagan renaissance. What he found was a site of profound decay and poverty. The once magnificent temple was a ruin, the sacred precinct neglected. The Pythia, if she could still be called that, was no longer a figure of immense prestige, but a local woman presiding over a forgotten shrine. Her response to the emperor's query was not a cryptic riddle or a grand prophecy. It was a stark, poetic, and heartbreaking eulogy. It has been recorded as the very last utterance of the Delphic oracle. She told Oribasius, "Tell the king The fair wrought hall has fallen to the ground. Phoebus has no longer his house, nor his mantic bay, nor his prophetic spring. The speaking water is quenched. It was an unambiguous declaration of the end. Apollo had departed. The divine presence that had animated the site for over 1,000 years was gone. The magic, the mystery, the voice, all were extinguished. There was nothing left to rebuild. Julian's dream of a pagan revival perished with him on a Persian battlefield the following year. The final decisive blow to Delphi came a generation later. In 392 AD, the staunchly Christian emperor Theodosius I issued a series of edicts that outlawed all pagan practices. The temples were to be closed, their lands confiscated, and their rituals forbidden. The eternal flame on the altar of Apollo, which had burned for centuries, was extinguished. The Oracle of Delphi was now officially silent, not by choice or by the fading of vapors, but by imperial decree. For the first time in recorded history, the slopes of Parnassus no longer held a divine voice. The great sanctuary was abandoned to the elements, its purpose concluded, its story seemingly over. For more than 1,400 years, the oracle's silence was absolute. The magnificent sanctuary of Delphi disappeared from sight, though never from memory. Earthquakes and landslides tumbled the great columns and buried the temples under tons of rock and soil. Over the ruins, a new village grew. By the 19th century, the houses of a small settlement named Castri stood directly on top of the hidden temple of Apollo. The exact location of the world's most famous oracle was lost, a subject of scholarly speculation and romantic fantasy. The tide began to turn with the rise of modern archaeology and the West's renewed fascination with classical antiquity. European travelers, artists, and scholars made the arduous journey to the slopes of Parnassus, sketching the few visible column fragments and dreaming of the treasures that lay beneath the village. The definitive chapter in Delphi's rediscovery began in the late 19th century, driven by the ambition of the French school at Athens. They secured the rights from the Greek government to conduct a massive excavation, an undertaking of unprecedented scale known as the Grande Fouille, or the Great Excavation. There was one enormous obstacle: the village of Castri. Before a single shovel could break ground, the entire village had to be moved. In a remarkable feat of diplomacy and engineering, the French government financed the relocation of hundreds of residents, building an entirely new town for them a short distance away, the modern village of Delphi that exists today. With the site cleared, the excavation began in earnest in 1892 under the direction of archaeologist Théophile Homole. For 10 years, teams of laborers painstakingly removed the layers of earth that had entombed the sanctuary. It was a moment of breathtaking discovery. The world of ancient Greece re-emerged into the sunlight. They uncovered the foundations of the great temple of Apollo, the path of the sacred way, and the elegant treasuries built by city-states like Athens and Sipnos. The theater, with its stunning views of the valley below, was revealed, as was the stadium, nestled even higher up the mountain. Along with the architecture came a staggering wealth of artifacts. Inscriptions provided invaluable historical records, and thousands of votive offerings were found. The most spectacular discovery of all came in 1896, the Charioteer of Delphi. This life-sized bronze statue, with its inlaid eyes and exquisite detail, was a masterpiece of classical art, perfectly preserved beneath the earth. The great excavation was a resurrection. It brought the physical reality of Delphi back to life, allowing the stones to tell their stories once more. Today, visitors from across the globe walk the sacred way at Delphi. They are not pilgrims bearing gifts for the god, but tourists and students seeking a connection to a profound past. The Pythia's chamber is empty, her voice is gone, but the power of Delphi endures, transformed from a religious oracle into a cultural touchstone for all humanity. What, then, is the ultimate legacy of this silent sanctuary? It lies not in the prophecies of war and fortune, but in the timeless wisdom that was literally carved into its stones. Inscribed on the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo were two foundational maxims of Western thought: know thyself and nothing in excess. These phrases marked a pivotal evolution in human consciousness. They redirected the focus from external, divine pronouncements to the internal world of human reason, introspection, and self-control. To know thyself is the fundamental challenge of philosophy and psychology. It is the beginning of all wisdom, a call to understand one's own motivations, flaws, and potential. Nothing in excess is the principle of the golden mean, the call for balance, moderation, and harmony in all things. These ideas, nurtured at Delphi, flowed into the works of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, forming the bedrock of classical philosophy and shaping the intellectual heritage of the modern world. The influence of the Oracle echoes in unexpected places. The very concept of a trusted source of profound insight has been woven into our culture. In business and research, the Delphi method is a forecasting technique that relies on a panel of experts to reach a consensus, a modern echo of consulting the wise priestess. The site itself, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is recognized as a place of outstanding universal value. It stands as a testament to a shared human story, a place where for 1,000 years, people from all corners of the known world came together in a common search for meaning and guidance. Delphi's final and most enduring prophecy was not one spoken by the Pythia. It was the silent message left behind by its own existence, that the human quest for knowledge, for self-awareness, and for a balanced place in the cosmos is an eternal one. The specific answers given by the Oracle may have faded into history, but the fundamental questions that drove humanity to her doorstep still resonate within us all. They echo on the slopes of Parnassus, a timeless invitation to look both to the heavens and within.